Police officers often put themselves in danger just being in the line of duty. But what if that includes encountering forces beyond this plane of existence? Well, that's exactly what these police officers in this episode experienced. And in fact, they're so terrifying and downright bizarre, it'll make you rethink the reality we live in. You won't want to miss this one. Our first story takes place on August 15th, 1976. Officer Brian Goslin was patrolling the rural roads around the small town of Whitehall, New York, on what should have been a typical calm summer night. But little did he know that his quiet evening shift was about to take a turn for the bizarre and terrifying. Now, as Goslin's police cruiser would roll down the isolated Aber Road, which is surrounded by thick forest on both sides, something massive emerged from the tree line up ahead of him, and about 30 feet in front of him, this towering hair-covered beast would lumber out onto the road. Goslin slammed on the brakes, his eyes widening in disbelief, and this thing was shaped like a man, but stood at least 8 feet tall and appeared to weigh over 400 pounds of solid muscle. As if its tremendous size wasn't terrifying enough, this thing's eyes glowed this eerie demonic red. And now Goslin had been a police officer at this point for several years, but nothing could have prepared him for this experience. I mean, despite his training, he was just overcome by a primal fear. In fact, it was numbing. And so he's fumbling and shaking. He throws open his car door. He stumbles out, desperately shining his spotlight on this thing while raising his service pistol, and his hands are trembling. He doesn't know what to do. And this brilliant light seemed to anger this thing, causing it to throw its head back, and it unleashed this bone-chilling shriek that reverberated through the trees around them. And so Goslin felt the sound rattle his very core as this thing turned and bounded back into the blackness of the woods with an almost inhuman, remarkable speed, leaving only a trail of footprints in a nearby field. And now at this point, he's completely shaken to his core. He immediately radios in to report this bizarre sighting, and he's worried he might sound insane or like a crackpot describing this 8-foot-tall monster that he had just encountered. But over the next few nights, his fellow officers would radio in with their own shocking and disturbing encounters. More sightings of the same gargantuan hair-covered humanoid seen prowling the woods near Aber Road. Even Goslin's own father and brother claimed to have laid eyes on the thing this same time period. Now, despite this small army of police that have been scouring the area, this thing seemed to have vanished back into the wilderness as quickly as it appeared, and Goslin was forever tormented by the events of this night, even years later as he would recount his own story to those who would listen, and in his book, the 2018 Aber Road, The True Story, in hopes of discovering what malevolent force he truly had come face to face with in the forest outside the tiny town of Whitehall. And now, as for what this colossal red-eyed humanoid was, where it came from, and where it went after being spotted by multiple credible eyewitnesses, police officer and civilians alike, it all remains one enduring, bone-chilling mystery. In fact, many of the people who have heard his story and have had their own experiences wonder that, is this a being that possesses high levels of intelligence? Is this an interdimensional being? Is it a demonic entity? Well, whatever the truth may be, its existence has truly rooted itself in the community and the surrounding areas. More people than just Goslin, those handful of police officers and eyewitnesses of that night, have talked about seeing something similar. In fact, the entire area all around upstate New York have many horrific accounts of supernatural entities, not just like the one that Brian saw, but also one that's described as being similar to that of a canine, and some I've heard are described with horns. I mean, there's clearly a multitude of strange beings around this area. And in fact, just a few years later, on a chilly February night in 1982, officers Dan Gordon and his partner were patrolling along the quiet Route 22 near East Bay at the base of Lake Champlain. It was a routine night shift for the two cops, and they were just doing their rounds and keeping an eye out for any trouble, but little did they know, they were about to have an encounter that would shake them to the core. And as their patrol car crested a hill, something massive would dart across the road right in front of them, and so Dan slammed on his brakes as his partner let out a startled yell, and there, illuminated in their headlights for just a moment, was this 8-foot-tall ape-like being. But this was no ordinary Bigfoot sighting, and it's also important to note that this area of New York was no stranger to Bigfoot reports, because over the years there had been numerous claims of large hairy bipeds roaming the forest and hills, but what Dan and his partner witnessed that night was different, almost human-like in its movements, yet decidedly not human. This thing was lanky and lean, but instead of a bulky muscular frames that are typical with Bigfoot descriptions, its shoulders were narrow, its arms were extraordinarily long and gangly, and even though despite its towering height, it moved with this unmistakable slouch, almost a shuffle. And then there was the speed at which this thing crossed and scrambled up a steep embankment into the brush on the other side. It was far too agile for any normal human. But Dan didn't hesitate. He flung open the car door, determined to pursue this thing and get to the bottom of what they had just seen. His partner, however, remained just frozen in the passenger seat, too terrified to move, and by the time that Dan had reached the embankment, this strange thing had already vanished into the night, leaving only questions in its wake. And for over 20 years now, the two officers kept that deeply unsettling experience to themselves. It was the kind of story that could easily end a career if told, with colleagues and the public writing it off as some fanciful tale. But the memory of that February night in 1982 never left them. Now finally, in 2003, Dan Gordon decided to go public with his account, and in a series of interviews with news outlets, television shows, and even Monster Quest, in the book Bigfoot Encounters in New York and New England, he recounted in vivid detail that chilling encounter all those years ago. And of course, despite the ridicule that he may have faced, he stood firm that this was an honest, trustworthy man, insisting on the veracity of what he had witnessed until his dying day in 2014. And so the baffling case of the lanky ape-like creature glimpsed that February night in 1982 remains unsolved. What was this bizarre being that seemed so human? Well, unfortunately, as you're going to see in the following stories, things get a little crazier. In the spring of 1970, the quiet town of Marrero, Louisiana, was about to experience something that would leave two police officers questioning everything they thought they ever knew. It was a warm evening around 9 p.m. when the Jefferson Parish Police Department received a frantic call from a terrified homeowner who reported a prowler on their property. And so officers James Laundrie and Michael Dubois were the first to respond to the scene, and as they pulled up to the house, they could see the female homeowner standing on her front porch, and she was very visibly shaken. And so the officers approached her, trying to do their best to calm her down and just really get a clear understanding of what had happened here. Now, the woman, Mrs. Johnson, explained that she had been in her living room just simply watching TV when she heard strange noises that were coming from the outside. And at first, she assumed it was an animal, but the sounds grew louder and louder and closer to the house. and she realized that it had to have been something else entirely, and so she had called the police immediately because she was fearing for her safety. And so Officers Laundrie and Dubois assured Mrs. Johnson that they would thoroughly investigate the property and made sure that she was going to be okay. And so they began doing a full perimeter sweep of the property, their hands resting on their holstered guns, ready for anything. And as they searched for more, they would begin to radio for backup, requesting a canine unit to come and assist them. And so when the canine unit arrived, the dog, who was a German Shepherd named Max, was immediately on high alert. And not just high alert, but he seemed agitated and scared, and he'd be whining and cowering behind his handler. And this behavior, by the way, was highly unusual for a trained police dog. And his demeanor clearly put the officers on edge. And Max did his best to lead the way, and the officers followed. And at this point, because of how off-put the officers were, their guns were drawn, they were convinced that the trespasser was hiding somewhere on the property, just waiting to make their move. And so at one point, they rounded the corner of the house, and they would spot this dark figure, this form huddled against the side of the building, as if trying to remain unseen. And the officers spotting this person, they trained their flashlights on the figure and they shouted for it to show itself, to show its hands and step out slowly. But as this thing moved, immediately they realized this wasn't a human being they were dealing with. Whatever this was massive. It was standing at least 8 feet tall. It was incredibly wide. And as it stepped out from the shadows, the officers could see that it was covered in dark brown hair from head to toe, and this thing took long, powerful strides as it moved out towards the direction of the street and passed directly under a streetlight. And in the brief moment of illumination, the officers got a pretty good look at its face, and they saw that it had deep-set, intelligent eyes and a very pronounced brow ridge. Its nose was broad and flat, and its mouth was wide, and it revealed large yellowed teeth. Now, stunned by what they were seeing, they were frozen in place as this thing bolted towards a nearby wooded marshy area right next to a canal. And in just a matter of seconds, it had completely disappeared in the darkness, leaving the officers and Max just standing there trying to process what just happened. And they couldn't really do much, and so they went back and told Mrs. Johnson that they had found the person, that they had ran away, and they'd be patrolling the area over the course of the night to ensure that she was safe, but rest assured everything would be okay. Now, in the days that followed, Officers Laundrie and Dubois filed their report detailing their encounter with this unknown thing. And as you can imagine, they faced skepticism and ridicule from some of their colleagues, but they stood by their account knowing what they had seen. Now, the incident in Marrero, Louisiana, easily remains one of the most compelling and well-documented Bigfoot sightings reported by trained police officers, and it raises some serious questions about the existence of these elusive beings and the possibility that they may be living among us just out of sight. Now, what's also interesting is the officer would later be interviewed by a BFRO investigator, and he would say this: "The incident with the entity was officially reported in the record system of that jurisdiction. I remember that we did not emphasize the subject beyond describing it as very tall and dark in color, with no specific description of any clothing, etc. And because it wasn't wearing any clothes, and as I told you, in those days I had no idea what I was looking at. Our superiors knew from us verbally what we had seen, and then it was dropped. We handled many unexplainable incidents, as do police agencies now. The public just never hears about them. This is what I mentioned to you about me going back 7 years later and not finding the reports. My partner died when he was just 37 years old, so we never had any chance to speak about anything again before he checked out. He was a quiet, no-nonsense guy who wasn't comfortable talking about a lot of the incidents we handled, including other unexplainable incidents." Now, Some believe it may have been a Bigfoot, while others speculate that it could have been something else entirely, right, like a rougarou. But as for the strange creature that officers Laundrie and Dubois encountered that night, well, that remains inconclusive. On a night in 1966, officers C. Hutchins and A. Husky were driving down the West Buford Street extension in Gaffney, South Carolina, and then, as they neared a right-angle bend in the road, a metallic object suddenly bloomed out of the darkness and into their headlights. And the car did not stall as the spherical object, which had a wide flat brim around it and no visible lights or portholes, just settled to within just a few feet of the ground. And so both men got out of their car, completely baffled with amazement. And now Officer Hutchins later estimated that the object must have been about 20 feet in diameter. And then this small door suddenly opened noiselessly on the underside of the sphere, and this kind of ladder that was roughly 4 to 6 feet long just drops down, white light pouring out of the opening, but neither man could see anything in the interior. And then a figure appears in the doorway and descends the ladder and walks slowly and deliberately towards both these police officers. And now both the officers are thinking, what in the world is happening? Is this really going on right now? And so this figure stops when it reached a point maybe roughly 15 to 20 feet from these two men, and Hutchins and his partner were in complete awe and shock at not only what they were experiencing, but what they were looking at. And they were about to go through a series of very bizarre and disturbing events over the next several minutes. Afterward, the door closed quietly and the craft began to whir. It was a soft whirring sound like an engine with a muffler on it. The object rose slowly and then vanished into the sky. Both officers stood there, mouth agape, trying to process what had just happened. It was like something out of a science fiction movie, but it had been all too real. And it wasn't until later on that these two officers would get to detail their full experience and explain that the being they had encountered was anything but normal. Now, interestingly, Hutchins later explained that it didn't move swiftly at all and that it moved just like you or I would. Slow, deliberate, and like he was taking his sweet time. And that it or he didn't appear to be scared at all. The being was roughly the size of a 12-year-old boy, maybe 4 feet tall at most, and it had no helmet or headgear of any kind and was dressed in this strange golden suit that had no buttons or zippers. It was like this metallic metal that reflected the light from their vehicle's headlights. It was so very bizarre. However, even stranger was the conversation that transpired between the being and the two officers. And somehow this alien spoke perfect English, and these two men would later explain that this thing didn't have an accent of any kind or any way. Its speech was very precise, very pronounced, and articulate. And then this thing demanded to know why the two police officers were dressed the way they were. It didn't make sense to this being. Well, after a few more moments of interaction, this being announced that it would return in 2 days before climbing back into the craft and vanishing for good. And so a local councilman actually found numerous footprints at the site where the little man had stood, but there was no return visit by the alien. And so the officers were basically left with more questions than answers, wondering if they would ever see this strange being again, or if anyone would even believe their incredible story. The footprints found at the scene added an extra layer of mystery to all of this because ultimately, the being's true nature and purpose remained unknown. Now, as far as the bizarre encounter, the metallic sphere, the being that appeared out of nowhere, the humanoid figure that spoke perfect English, and the promise of a return visit that never came to pass, or so we know, it all remains a mystery. On a cold December night in 1967, Sergeant Herbert Schirmer, a 22-year-old state trooper from Ashland, Nebraska, was out on patrol investigating reports of disturbances among the local livestock. It seemed that a predator of some sort was prowling around, but little did Schirmer know that he was about to encounter something far more bizarre than just a mere animal. And so as he drove along the dark, lonely road, he suddenly came across what he initially thought was a truck parked right in the middle of the road ahead. But as he approached this object, he realized that this was no ordinary vehicle. Instead, it was a strange football-shaped craft that glowed with this strange light, and the object had portholes with red light around its circumference, adding to this strange appearance. And so Schirmer watched in awe as this craft actually hovered above the ground for a moment, and then it shot off into the night very quickly. And at the time, it seemed like this thing had ended there, but this story was far from over, because later on, under hypnosis, Schirmer recalled a very different version of events. Instead of simply departing, the object had moved to a nearby field and landed on 3 legs, and as it did so, Schirmer's radio, lights, and engine all failed, just leaving him stranded in the darkness. And then to his shock, beings would approach his car, but despite his best efforts, he found himself unable to flee or even draw his revolver, as if some mental block had been placed upon him. And one of these beings sprayed this greenish gas at his car, while another shone this paralyzing bright light at him. And so, paralyzed and overwhelmed, he lost consciousness. But when he regained it, he was able to get a pretty good look at these beings. They were humanoid, standing around 5 feet tall with thin heads, elongated heads, mind you, flat noses, slitted mouths, slanted, unblinking eyes, and their skin was a gray, pale white, and they wore silvery gray uniforms, boots, gloves, and helmets. And each helmet had a small antenna, and the uniforms bore the emblem of a winged serpent on the left breast. And Schirmer exited his car, and one of the beings, who seemed to be the leader, had approached him. The leader asked if Schirmer was the Watchman, and then invited him aboard the ship. A ladder descended, and Schirmer, feeling compelled to comply, would enter the craft. It was almost as if he was under some sort of trance. And when he boarded inside the room, everything was cold and illuminated by strips of light in the ceiling. And if he could estimate, it was probably around 20 by 26 feet and was maybe 6 feet tall. And the space contained chairs and a control panel and a viewing screen. And he even noticed that the engine had this crystalline rotor linked to 2 columns. It's very strange. And the leader then demonstrated a device that resembled a tape player, and it seemed to transfer data directly into Schirmer's mind, even as he conversed with this host. And the being spoke in broken English, with the sound appearing to come from deep within, but Schirmer found that he could understand the messages through telepathy. And the leader revealed that they came from another galaxy, but apparently they had bases on other planets in the solar system, as well as beneath the sea and in the polar regions. And this ship supposedly utilized an electromagnetic propulsion system and used water to operate and maintain a protective field. Now, these beings, as the leader would explain it to Schirmer, were contacting Earthlings as a way to prepare them for eventual open contact and to prevent them from destroying the Earth. However, they also wanted to create some confusion among humans. Schirmer saw images on the screen of beings standing guard outside the ship, craft flying against a backdrop of stars, and a mothership in space. And as the encounter drew to a close, the leader would ask Schirmer to forget the experience and then led him out of the ship. And so Schirmer, still in this trance-like state, returned to his patrol car and just watched as the ship took off into the night and was gone. And so later that night, Schirmer felt extremely sick, weak, and nervous, and discovered a red welt on his neck. And he suffered from this chronic buzzing in his ears. Sleep became difficult, and the experience ultimately led him to leave police work altogether. Now, during the investigation into the incident, he refused to reveal some aspects of his experience. The physical effects he suffered, such as the red welts and the chronic buzzing in his ears, as well as his decision to leave the police force, all suggest that something very profound and life-altering took place that cold December night in 1967. Now, whether Schirmer's experience was a genuine encounter with extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings, or maybe the results of some other unexplained phenomenon, as well as the strange craft encountered and the incredible story he recalled under hypnosis, it all remains a mystery. On a dark night in Liberty County, Texas, an off-duty police officer was driving northbound on Farm to Market Highway 1008 just north of Kennefic. And so he was traveling at about 55 miles an hour right behind this big 18-wheel truck. The officer, James, had just finished a long shift and was looking forward to getting home to his family. And so as James followed behind the truck, his mind began to wander, just thinking about the day's events and what he needed to do the next day. But suddenly, a fleeting movement from the side of the road had caught his attention, and so he quickly had focused his eyes trying to make out what he had just seen. And then, to his shock, this large thing in an upright position ran out of the tree line on the east side of the highway, and it moved with incredible speed, a speed that James estimated was probably about 35 miles an hour, that took extremely long strides, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Now, this thing ran directly in front of the big truck, causing the driver to brake hard and swerve to the east side of the road, and miraculously, the thing was unharmed and actually cleared the road, disappearing into the tree line on the west side. Now, interestingly, James got a pretty good look at this thing right as it passed in front of the truck's headlights, and he described that it appeared to be as tall as the cab of the 18-wheeler, maybe 8 feet, and it was very bulky but covered in gray hair. And James was certain that it was a biped walking on 2 legs like a human would. Now, despite his training as an officer, he was greatly intimidated by what he had just witnessed. He even carried a .45 semi-automatic handgun with him, but the sidearm gave him little or no security after having seen such a large being. In retrospect, James wishes he had slowed down or even stopped to get a second or better look, and he also regretted not flagging the rig down somehow to get the truck driver's perspective. But obviously in the moment, you're just under so much shock and fright, you don't really know what to do but just keep driving. Now, what's interesting is after this happened, James would actually learn that he is far from the only person to have seen something like this. And in fact, there are many other law enforcement personnel in the area of Kennefic alone who've also had similar sightings. And even before the experience, James himself had personally heard of numerous stories encountering this large beast. Now, interestingly, investigator Daryl Coiler, who actually conducted a follow-up interview with James, was very impressed by his credibility. And Coiler noted that James categorically ruled out the possibility of a hoax, given the figure's speed, the size, the height, and the fact that it nearly collided with an 18-wheeler. Now, as far as its identity, its size, the speed, the grayish hair covering its body, and its bipedal nature, it all remains one big mystery. This last section is more of a series of shorter accounts that I believe ties together because they all report very similar things. In 1976, 3 local police officers and a professor from El Pedroso, Sevilla, Spain, had gone out on a hunting trip, and so as they rounded a curve in the road, they saw this huge figure standing there, measuring around 2 meters tall, 6.5 feet tall for those that are not in the metric system. And now, what was strange about this figure was that it was hovering in the air just above the ground. Apparently, it wore a shiny white outfit and its facial features were not fully visible. In fact, it also wore a white belt that had a bright rectangular light on the buckle area. And then, as they sat there, they saw through the rearview mirror this huge, brilliant object apparently on the ground, an oval shape that emitted a dim, uniform light. And despite their curious nature, they were terrified and decided to cancel the hunting trip altogether, and they drove away from there. Now, around that same time, another officer, Frank Ingargiola, and newspaper reporter Sonny Schwartz also had a very similar experience. They were in Ventnor, Atlantic, New Jersey, when they witnessed a spherical white luminous object with this bright haze around it over the boardwalk along the sea. And this object seemed to be following them, and as they wondered what to do, they observed near the object a very tall man with immense broad shoulders, and he was lurching down the boardwalk in front of the car, and he wore this long suede coat and a 10-gallon Stetson hat. Fast forward to 1990, and several police officers guarding the area of Lajas Airport in Puerto Rico, where the radar blimp was stored, had a very bizarre encounter. One night, one of the policemen noticed from a distance that there seemed to be some children playing on a concrete platform for the anchoring of the blimp. And so he would go and approach the site in his patrol car, and he'd turn on his car's spotlight, only to see that instead of children, the ones there were very strange looking creatures described by him as 3 feet tall, big-headed, gray in color, and the small beings fled running in different directions. And the policeman called by radio asking for backup, repeating the 1050 code, which is officer needs assistance. But when help arrived, these things were gone. They vanished entirely. And an extensive search was carried out, but to no avail. And some days later, another group of policemen there saw a top-shaped UFO with a golden aura around it that almost landed on the aerostat premises. And the next day, another of the mysterious circles appeared on the ground right where the UFO was sighted. And the circle was erased from the ground when orders were given to use a bulldozer and remove the topsoil. Now, as far as these strange encounters go, the hovering humanoid in Spain, the small gray beings and crop circles in Puerto Rico, it all remains mysterious. Now, despite investigations and searches, no clear explanations have ever been found for any of these bizarre occurrences witnessed by the multitude of police officers in this episode. It seems as if the true nature of these entities and objects will continue to go unsolved. But you know what's not unsolved? Why you should totally hit that like and subscribe button. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment down below terrifying police stories, so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy these kinds of stories where we dive deep into storytelling of strange, mysterious, supernatural, and just bizarre stories that happen, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. And as always, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.